In my previous video I showed a little glimpse of this computer hardware sitting here, and the reason that is here is because I'm planning to install it in my friend's machine. You guys probably remember this monster system from 2011 that he bought all this and the top of the line peripherals and monitor. It was like $3 grand for the whole package, and people are still laughing at that to this day, saying, oh, you could have done so much better than the LGA 1366 platform and blah blah blah, and my computer cost a third as much and goes faster than this. Well, truth be told, the motherboard and chip were not much of the cost for this whole system. It was the case, the monitor, the keyboard, the mouse, the power supply, the 12 gig RAM kit, the additional Noctua fans, all that stuff really was the reason it cost so much. The Western Digital RE, I think there are RE4 server hard drives in there. Those weren't cheap back in 2011. So yeah, and the GeForce GTX 570, that thing still can hold its own, even up against some of the newer cards. I think it's about as fast as my Radeon 7870 that I've only had for a fraction of as long as he's had this card. But anyway, this system, the reason we're going to be swapping it out is because not only is this i7 obsolete now and the platform is pretty much abandoned by Intel, it has a very strange problem. You can be sitting here using the computer and it will just turn off out of nowhere like you unplugged it. And most of the time it refuses to turn back on. And then sometimes you'll be sitting there waiting and it'll just turn back on by itself like nothing was wrong. And you would think that it was the power supply, but we've tried 3 different ones and the problem persists. And what's very strange about this is that initially we thought there was a problem with the wiring going to the fans up top, because when we left those unplugged, the thing worked for like 2 months. And but all of a sudden the problem came back, even with the fans disconnected, and I'm wondering if this motherboard may be suffering from socket warpage. I know a while back when the i7s were a new thing, Foxconn, the company that makes the CPU sockets, had supplied a bad batch of sockets to several manufacturers, and after a while the socket would warp and the pins would lose contact and it would burn up the back of the chip and the socket would melt. Whether or not that's an issue with this system or not, I really don't know. But either way, it's old and we're ready to do an upgrade on this. And that FX8350, although nowhere near top of the line, is still notably faster than this old i7-950. You see right now, yep, it just turned off. It didn't run very long that time at all. And it's back on. This thing is so goofy. Will it actually post? Looks like it will. Need to get into the boot menu here because I don't want it going into Windows. Okay. Boot off the USB stick. So I got memtest in here. And the funny thing is, I could about guarantee you, if I unplug those fans, it'll run. It'll probably run all night long. But for some reason, when the cooling fans are plugged in, the power supply is much more sensitive to whatever's going on with the board and or CPU. And it's probably because it shares the same single 12-volt rail. I'm thinking there's a bad connection in the CPU socket or some other strange problem that is putting a rapid fluctuation of current on the 12-volt rail. And the fans also induce a lot of noise onto that same rail, and maybe it's just enough to put it over the edge of triggering the safety shutdown in the power supply with those fans running. I really can't think of any logical explanation for the system to behave the way it does. I mean, you can bump it, prod it, poke it, and it's perfectly stable. It just decides when it wants to turn off and turn back on. I think we've unhooked the power switch on the front of the case and all that stuff. It's just goofy, and with the age of this hardware, I figured it'd be a good upgrade anyway. But I think that's enough rambling on this. So when he gets back tomorrow night with the replacement power supply, we're going to go ahead and pull all this stuff out of here and install the new AMD hardware. And he's actually shied away from Intel permanently on this, I think, now that this has all happened. And in fact, my own system, I was going to build an i7 for my next system, and really I'm thinking about sticking with the FX8350 or something similar in my next build too. So anyway, I'll continue this tomorrow night. Here's the inside of that ST1000 power supply. It looks great in here, other than the fact that it has those cheap TPO capacitors in it. For some reason the fan is not turning on. I'm pretty sure it's temperature controlled, but it should have been running at this point because these heat sinks are almost uncomfortably warm, and it's been off for, you know, a few minutes now. Maybe it's a good thing to be changing this power supply anyway. It's about, what, 4 or 5 years old now, and yeah, due for a swap. Well, I found this old 400 watt Silverstone power supply laying around. I'm going to use this to test it. Hopefully it'll be big enough. I've also disconnected all of his drives and hooked up one of my own older SATA drives that has a Linux install on it. It actually came out of that little shuttle cube computer, and I want to see if this thing will run, you know, start up and run Linux. It'll give me something to test it with. So I've got it in standby right now. Let's try turning it on. Powered down. Will it come back on its own? There it goes. It seems like it always has to try twice. Excuse me. Yeah. Alright. Wonder if it's just going to boot from the hard drive on its own, or if I'm going to have to take out this USB stick. Let's exit out of here. Yeah, watch, this thing ends up running perfect on this small power supply. I doubt it though. I'm pretty sure there's something wrong with it. I've also cleaned the RAM slots and eliminated that possibility, so all I've got left to look at as far as bad connections is the CPU socket, but usually if that's an issue, there's not much else I can do. And Linux is booting, yay! I'll be back in 1 second. Well, the window manager on this Linux install crashed, probably because I don't have the right video driver, so I'm going to see if it can if it can change the driver on its own here to the NVIDIA driver. I think it had a Radeon driver installed for the old shuttle computer before, which explains the crash. This will be the first time running Linux Mint on a what I would consider a modern computer anyway. Be interesting to see how it performs. You know, this way, if the thing crashes or powers off randomly, I don't need to worry about damage to any of his hard drives. I can just mess around with it like this and leave the other drives disconnected. Alright, I had to do a full reboot and then it actually worked. Just logging out and back in after installing the driver didn't take. And I even got audio now, so I'm going to play around with this thing for a while and see how stable it is. So far, no more power problems. The funny thing is, this power supply only has a 4-pin 12-volt connector, and those wires are getting warm, so I know that CPU is pulling some juice. Only time will tell what the heck is wrong with this thing, but either way, we got to get that new power supply installed in there, and probably going to do that board swap regardless. And I'll move this board over to my workshop computer over there, where the stability doesn't really matter, and toy with it some more in that. This is crazy. This power supply is working really hard because I can hear the, you know, it's making whining noise, and depending on what I do on screen here, I have Gary's mod loaded up here in Linux, and depending on how much stuff is on the screen, the louder it gets. I don't know if that's going to pick up on camera at all, but I can tell you that these wires up here that run the CPU are getting a little warm, so I want to mess with it a little bit more and then leave it for tomorrow. But I'm still wondering if there's something to do with the power supply not agreeing with the board, but it's just strange because it worked for years before the problem popped up. I really don't know. I'm baffled, and I've seen a lot of weird computer problems, but this takes the cake. Alright, I've been running this thing for 3-4 hours now without any issues. The reason it was taking a couple tries to power up was because I had the XMP profile enabled, which speeds the memory up quite a bit and also slightly speeds up the processor. And I think maybe the power supply is not big enough, or it just doesn't, it just doesn't like those settings. But whenever I run it with the default clocks, it runs the RAM at 1066, and standard clock speed and everything, it always turns on the first time. And the funny thing is, this system seems to work fine with a smaller power supply in it, but both of the larger ones we've tried to put in, the 1000 watt and the 750 watt that he bought new, it behaved the same way. And like I was saying, those fans in the top seem to have something to do with it, but obviously the fans are fine. Everything's probably fine in this because it works okay on this power supply, but I don't understand. I really don't. We're going to change the power supply later tonight and see how it behaves with this board, but more than likely we're going to go ahead and upgrade it anyway. Well, here it is with all the new hardware installed. The new motherboard actually blends in with the case a little bit better because it's black where the other one was blue. And so far everything's working okay, except that I think this GTX 570 card doesn't really agree with the chipset. Very similar problem to what I was having when I had the GTX 460 in my computer upstairs a few years ago, and I ended up having to put a Radeon card in because certain things that use the 3D acceleration would just drop back to Windows and say the driver has stopped responding and has recovered, and this seems to do the same thing on certain programs. So we may end up putting another Radeon R9 290 in this or something, but everything else is all set. So later on this weekend I'm probably going to be experimenting with the old board and chip. I'm thinking about putting it in this computer here and then taking that motherboard out and using it for another project, but that'll give me something to do anyway. I did some more testing on this i7 board last night, and for the most part it works. It doesn't turn off on me, but it had some other quirks going on. The major issue I had was I changed some settings in the BIOS, and when I saved and exit, it didn't post. And I waited a bit and hit the reset button, and then it came back up and said the master BIOS was corrupt, and it reloaded the image from the secondary BIOS and reprogrammed itself, and it was fine after that. But it never did turn off on me or anything, using the Radeon HD 5450 and running at stock speeds with a single stick of RAM. We used the other two sticks in the AMD board, and they actually worked better in there than they did in this board. Go figure. I also found out that the power supply, the original one from when the system was first built, the fan is definitely not turning on like it's supposed to be. It's not seized up or anything. It turns perfectly fine, but that thing got pretty hot and the fan never turned on, so I ended up sitting this in front of it to keep it running while I was in the middle of a software install. But what I'm going to do at this point is pull the CPU out, check the pins on that just out of curiosity, and I'm going to go ahead and install it in this computer over here so I can experiment with it some more. That's got a GeForce GTX 460 card in it and a decent power supply. And I really don't care about absolute stability in that system because the only thing that's used for is playing a couple of games on a very rare occasion. It hardly ever gets turned on. And I really want to use the board that's in there to upgrade my mom's computer pretty soon, so if I can make this thing work good enough to use on the rare occasion that I need it, I'll be more than happy with it. So let me take this back apart and take a look at those CPU pins real quick. Here's a look at what's currently installed in the workshop computer. It's just a little micro ATX board, Gigabyte GA-H61M D2P-B3. Gotta love those long model numbers. The CPU is a Pentium G840, just a little entry-level CPU. And GeForce GTX 460, 4 gigs of RAM, Roswell Capstone, I believe it's a 450 watt power supply, a Pacer SSD, just a little cheap thing, and an LG, I think it's just a DVD burner, nothing special, and one Noctua case fan. This case is actually the Leon Lee K7B that was used as my main rig upstairs for a long time, and I brought it down here after I upgraded to that Corsair case that I have now. And one thing I noticed right away is that I'm going to have to find the rest of the motherboard standoffs for this case, because that i7 board is going to take up the complete size of the motherboard tray, and hopefully this thing has enough standoffs. With mounting a larger board like this, I was really glad that that case has a removable motherboard tray. It's a lot easier to mount a board on here when it's laying flat on the bench versus trying to wedge this thing in the case and get one of the screws started and hold the board up. You know, this board is pretty heavy, so it worked out good like this. But I'm looking at this board and I cannot believe the amount of components that this thing has on it. Being a high-end board at the time it was made, there was a lot of features that weren't built into the chipset, so it was done with external components. You know, so there's 2 or 3 external SATA controller chips on here, some external I/O controllers, and lots of other little components for, you know, like the diagnostic display and extra buttons and lots of little LEDs, things like that. And this board was really loaded for the time. You know, back, I think it was made probably late 2010, because we built the system in early 2011, if I remember right, and you know, at the time they needed to have a lot of extra components to do all this stuff. You know, the new motherboard we put in looked really bare in comparison. You know, there was a lot more stuff built onto the chipset on the newer board, so we didn't need external SATA 3 controllers or anything like that. But this board is also noticeably thicker and heavier than the new board that replaced it. Probably partly in because, again, the sheer component count, but this thing is a tank. All installed and ready for the power-up test. Will it work? Sweet, LEDs are working. Got a bad connection on my DVI adapter there. There we go. Wonder if Windows will start up with a different board. Going from one Intel board to another, so it should at least go into Windows. In fact, the other day when we put the AMD board in the system, Windows started right up. I was pretty surprised. Alright. Just got to do some driver installs, and we'll do some testing with some 3D benchmarks and see if this thing crashes. I think that's the longest list of devices I've ever seen Windows install in one go. Just pages and pages and pages. I'm going to do a reboot. Yeah, there we go. Oh, this chair is driving me crazy. Doggone it. There's a spring sticking out. One of these holes right here keeps poking me. Oh, I'll fix that when I get around to it. Yeah, it looks like it froze. Why am I not surprised? Yeah, this thing is definitely quirky. Throws at, it's either 50 or F or S0. To look at the manual and see what the code is for that. Doggone this thing. After I get it all mounted in there, of course, then it messes up. Well, I already had the BIOS updating utility on here from the other board, and it seems to work on this one, so I'm letting it update its BIOS. It's a few versions behind since it did a self-recovery. Hopefully it doesn't do a power failure on me and nuke the BIOS again. I don't know how many times that backup thing can be used. They also have a utility just like this for updating the BIOS on the video card. It's another reason I like to use gigabyte boards and cards, because the software utilities tend to work really well with these. I have to go into the BIOS and make sure everything is set right, especially the hard drive controller mode. Make sure that's on AHCI before Windows tries to boot. If the motherboard is going to see the USB keyboard to go into the BIOS, because a lot of times it doesn't. Okay, good. Yeah, see, it's back on IDE, so we need to change that. Yeah, I'll finish changing this stuff and get back to this in a second. Well, it's up and running. 8x anti-aliasing, 1280 by 1024. It moves along at a fairly decent rate for an older video card. I'm going to let this run for a while and come back and check on it in a bit. We're at 61 degrees Celsius. It's moving, cooking pretty good. You know what's funny? You can probably hear coil noise coming out of this computer. I can hear it a little bit. It's not really doing it now. Anyway, I think it's good enough for me to put it back on the workbench and move on to the next system. I don't really care about absolute stability with this, with as little as it gets used. Well, I got it up and running on the bench over here, but one problem I think I might have, I think it might overload this UPS, because it's sitting idle at more than 50-60% load, something around there. So let's see what happens if I run this benchmark and let that video card start pulling some juice. It's probably gonna... This thing pulls more juice than my i7-950 rig upstairs does. Holy crap. I'm really surprised this UPS, I wonder what the maximum load is on this, maybe 350 or 400 watts. Because it's almost maxed out in the load gauge right now. So I think my computer only pulls about 280 watts, 260 watts under load like this. So this i7 is a bit power hungry. Yeah, luckily the UPS seems to be coping with it alright though, so that's all I care. Being on this larger monitor really killed the frame rate though. I wonder if I turn off the anti-aliasing, if it'll help a bit. Still not doing too bad for what it is, I suppose. Anyway, I think I'm at the point that I can leave this thing alone, because like I said, it's probably not going to get turned on but once in a blue moon, so I'm going to call this one good. I've got that LGA 1155 board on the bench here just out of curiosity, and I noticed that the RAM is spec'd for CAS 7 and the motherboard was defaulting to 9, so I went in and manually set the timings, and that might improve the performance a little bit, taking 2 clock cycles off the CAS latency. So I'm going to run Memtest 86 Plus for a few laps and make sure that's stable, but I think this will be a nice board for my mom's computer. This has PCI Express 2.0 on it, and I think her board is 1.1 or something older than 2, I know for a fact. So after putting a larger CPU in there, I think it'll work real nice.